couple days ago, I was looking back at a project of mine called the Silver Series, and replayed some games, or rather, played some what-if games between the '70s Cowboys Raiders. And I was just checking on some stats, and I was on Walt Garrison's page on Pro Football Reference, and at the top of that page were a couple of new posts from a podcast called "The Game Before the Money," and lo and behold, I found out about Mr. Michael Jackson, who goes by the pen name Jackson Michael. He's a super football historian and a tabletop fanatic, just like us on the Strat-O side. Welcome, sir. It's a great pleasure.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And that 70s Cowboys Raiders matchup, it's really great to think about. I'm curious how that played out on your simulation, because that was always a game I wanted to see as a kid, and it never really happened.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. I created a 7-game series for all the times they could have met in the Super Bowl, and Cowboys won it at the end. I have a video on my channel actually about it. As exciting as it would have played out probably in real life. So really amazing what you can do with these things, these games.
Definitely. Yeah, and those were two great teams for sure.
So tell me about your football history. I mean, you started playing. You said you played these games as a kid, and you're, well into your 20s. But how did you become a fan of the game of football itself?
Yeah, I grew up in Wisconsin. My dad liked football. The first memory of football I have was the 1976 NFC Championship game, and the Vikings running back blocked field goal for a touchdown. So so that was when I was 6, and I must have known a little bit about football before, because I remember that I had wanted to watch the game. So the first season I really followed fully was 1977. And that was the Cowboys and Broncos in Super Bowl 12. Although I do remember Super Bowl 11 a little bit. I remember Willie Brown running back the touchdown. I remember the Sammy White hit and his helmet coming off. So yeah, I just really got into it. I really enjoyed sports as a kid. I loved the drama of sports. I loved the action of it. I loved playing sports as a kid in the yard with my friends. And eventually, I wanted to be the manager. I wanted to be the coach. I wanted to know how things would play out if the Cowboys played the Raiders. And so when I found out about Strat-O-Matic baseball through a Street and Smith's ad, which is probably how a lot of us got hooked on these things, it was I was bought in really quickly, and I spent a lot of the summer of 1984 in my bedroom with the Cubs on WGN while I was playing out the 1983 season on my Strat-O-Matic game.
Nice. That same here. I mean, we really overlap. Super Bowl 11 was the first one I really watched in its entirety. And Super Bowl 12 was the first and last time I bet on a Super Bowl. I bet some kid a dime that the Broncos would win. That did not turn out well. But so how did you then now evolve into your authorship in creating the Game Before the Money as a nonprofit?
I grew up loving football, and I grew up loving the players of the game. So, and with football, the lives of the players haven't really been well documented, especially when I started this. And a coworker of mine turned me on to The Glory of Their Times, which is an oral history of baseball around from the turn of the 20th century through the 1920s, even into the 30s, I guess. And I was like, man, somebody's got to do this for football. And it was just something that I wanted as a fan. Now, I didn't have any access to anybody. I didn't know any players or anything. And I was working as a professional musician. I was a guitar player. And I was playing a gig, and I started chatting with Robert Hurst, who was the official artist for the Texas Sports Hall of Fame. And we were talking about sports, and he mentioned that he had been friends with Night Train Lane. And I was like, gosh, I wish I would have met you then, because I really would have liked to meet him and interviewed him. And I told him about my idea, and he said, wow, that's a great idea. He's like, would you like to come to Bob Lilly's golf tournament in a few weeks, and I'll introduce you to a few players? And he's like, that sounds great. And then and that's really how it started. I met Walt Garrison there. I met Elvin Bethea, and I met Kenny Houston, and it all started from there, and it grew beyond whatever I could have imagined it to be. And it turns out, the players, they really appreciate the platform to tell their own story their own way. A lot of times when documentaries are made, there's kind of I don't want to say objective, but there's kind of a framework they want to work everything into a lot of the times. Whereas, I just want to roll the recorder and see what these guys had to say, and what their lives were like.
Well, how many Hall of Famers, and what are some of the most surprising stories that you've heard from these gentlemen?
Wow, that's a lot. I work for the Texas Sports Hall of Fame now, doing their podcast. So I've gotten to interview a lot of Texas Sports Hall of Famers, and several of them are in the Hall of Fame, like Ken Houston and Raymond Berry and Bob Lilly. And then a lot are in the book. Elvin Bethea, who I still keep in contact with quite a bit. He just got a chance to chat with him some more yesterday. And Carl Eller is another. Bart Starr, Frank Gifford, Bob Greasy, they're all in the book. Sonny Jurgensen, who's a great storyteller. Charlie Trippy, who's the oldest living Hall of Famer. He's 100 years old. So quite a few Hall of Famers. As far as surprising stories, one, I guess off the top of my head, Bart Starr didn't really play much his last 2 years in college. He was injured his junior year, and then his senior year they had a new coach, and he benched all the seniors. So the way Bart Starr got to the Packers was he was friends with Alabama's basketball coach. He used to go watch basketball practice. Bart Starr was a big basketball fan. And he'd go watch the Crimson Tide basketball practice, became friends with Johnny D, the coach, who was friends with the Packers scouting, head scout, Jack Venisi. And Johnny D recommended Bart Starr to the Packers, and they drafted him in the 17th round. And, Bart Starr had really only played his freshman and sophomore year at quarterback. That was the majority of his playing time in college. So when you think of Alabama great quarterbacks, you think of Namath, of course. You think of Ken Stabler, and you group Bart Starr in there as quarterbacks from Alabama, but he didn't really play much at Alabama, as it turns out.
Interesting. It's interesting. Speaking of Lombardi, I was just reading a piece about Bud Grant, the Vikings coach, and kind of his run-ins with Lombardi over the years. And I just thought that they tried to talk about the Vikings and the Super Bowl losses, and it seemed that just Bud Grant frames it so well that that's over. We went on with our lives. Or really, what some might say, a healthy attitude about it. I just wonder how the players you interview kind of framed their experiences vis-a-vis their after their post-football lives. I mean, do they feel generally that it helped inform their future careers, et cetera, things like that?
Yeah, well, I talked to Carl Eller. I asked him specifically about that. And for him, he said that they just felt like they needed to prove themselves year after year that they needed to get there, and losing the Super Bowl was painful and stayed with them for a long time. And I think with championships, because um, talking with the Cowboys players who played before they won the Super Bowl, who played with Don Meredith, I there was such a there seems to have been the way I understood it. There was such a close friendship with those '60s Cowboys, and Don Meredith was kind of the big brother. And I think there's kind of a feeling that they really wish they could have won a championship with Don Meredith. Um, and with the Vikings, you know, it's the same thing. Of course, they wish they would have won. The other way to look at it is, they won 4 NFC championship games, and they won 2 in a row. They almost won 3. They could have won 3 in a row. It was the Hail Mary that stopped them from going to the 1975 NFC championship game. So they came within 1 game of perhaps going to another Super Bowl. The other way to look at it, it's like, well, they were playing the Dolphins, who were undefeated the previous season, and then they were playing the Steelers, and then they played the Raiders, so and they were playing the Chiefs, so it's not like they were playing, easy teams. They weren't playing teams that were there on a fluke. The Vikings were up against some pretty great teams. And of course, if that had happened 10 years ago, 10 years before that, let's say that happened, well, they weren't around in the 50s, but, you take the Browns, who were in the championship game so many times in the 50s, even though they lost a few times, and the Rams, their legacies aren't tarnished by that. I guess some people might bring up that the Giants lost a lot in the championship games, but it's not really the forefront of their legacy.
And to be in that, I mean, that, that's rarefied air. Getting to a Super Bowl is or an NFL title game, AFL title game it's a huge deal. So it's no mean feat. I'm curious, the game before the money, you say you've got interviews from folks going back, Charlie Trippi. I mean, you cover a lot of eras, really kind of see changes in the way the game was played, how teams were built. And I wondered if the folks you interviewed, how they kind of viewed the evolution and view the evolution of the league, and how you personally view the evolution of the league into the product that's on the field today.
Yeah, it's a lot different, from one, and the reason why I call it the game before the money. Well, the full story is Larry McCarron, who's the center for the Packers. I saw him say in the paper once that he played before money, that he likes to say it that way. The NFL didn't have free agency until 1993. So, other sports had it in the 70s. And the other thing about the NFL is they still don't fully have free agency for the players because of the franchise tag. So they still get to restrict one player. But before free agency, guys were working in the off season. Bart Starr, early in his career, was selling cars, as he says in the book, and later he worked for Ford in promotions with Mike Ditka, of all people. Carroll Dale worked in a sporting goods store, the receiver for the Packers. And if you think about, I like to bring up the comparison. If you think about the Patriots winning the Super Bowl a few years ago, and then seeing Julian Edelman, stocking the local Dick's Sporting Goods. I mean, that's the way it was. Guys had to work in the off season. They had to plan for a career after football. Whereas today, that's a big change. And I don't get the impression that the older players are upset about that, because they're glad that players are getting paid more. The game brings in so much revenue. So the players, there's a great argument that the players deserve all that money. And I think they're happy for that. The problem comes with pensions, in that, with the collective bargaining agreements that were signed, the players are still in the terms of that collective bargaining agreement. So, like, I think in 1970, the pension was $10,000 a year. So for a certain amount of time, years played. So $10,000 a year in 1970 was a pretty fair pension. But if you're talking about, the year 2000, then it's quite different, in 2020. They've said, Don Maynard was telling me that for 17 years in pro ball, his pension was $400 and some dollars a month. There's stories of, well, I haven't heard this firsthand, so I won't go into lower pension money, but in Conrad Dobler's instance, like he said in the book, he's paid much more in medical bills than he ever made in the NFL. So these guys are incurring a lot of medical costs from football that their pensions don't cover. So that's one of the issues. And John Riggins has something called FAIR. And that's a group called Eller, has a Retired Players Association, and there has been some movement in that area. Mike Ditka has Gridiron Greats, of course, where he raises money to help guys out who need some help. So, but I don't think the players are upset what the players make now, but they're a brotherhood, and eventually, as Irv Cross put it in the book, everybody who plays in the NFL is a retired player at some point. And as far as evolution of the game, a lot of things are different. I like to bring up field conditions, are a lot different. The fields that they have today, they're meant for performance. They're not like Municipal Stadium in Cleveland where it was all muddy, Candlestick, the old days of Candlestick, Jim Brown running on the surface at the old Cleveland Stadium versus what Jim Brown might be able to do on some of these, performance turfs, for lack of a better, with the shoes and the traction and the year-long training and everything. Who knows how many yards Jim Brown would have in today's game.
If someone didn't know anything about the game of pro football, what chapters would you send them to in your book, your GBM, the Game Before the Money book?
Let's see. I would start, with reading the timelines. There are timelines before each section, which covers each decade, and that kind of gives an overview of pro football history as a standpoint. So I would do that, and then whatever team you're a fan of, jump to those chapters and get some background of, if you're a Cardinals fan, read Charlie Trippi's chapter, read Conrad Dobler's chapter. If you're a Steelers fan, read Rocky Blyer's chapter and Chuck Sharundolo's chapter. And, if you're a Packers fan, Bart Starr, Jim Taylor, Paul Hornung, several others.
And of course, you mentioned Elvin Bethea, and you've got a book on the wonderful, amazing '79 Oilers. What a team! Obviously the Oilers won the first two AFL titles and finished the '70s with a couple of pretty hard losses in the '78-'79 AFC Championship games. What was it about that '79 team that kind of made them stand out over that that first 20 years of their history?
Yeah, that Love You Blue era was really remarkable, and we both remember it as kids. And um, anyone out there, if you saw it on TV and saw the Astrodome and the energy inside that stadium, you just don't see that in pro sports. It was unlike anything else. And you can try to hyperbolize it or whatever, but that really truly was different than seeing the fan bases that we've seen throughout NFL history. I mean, even great fan bases. The only fan base that might have been similar really was the Steelers at the time, or maybe the Raiders.
Mm.
But with the enclosed Astrodome, um, it was quite an atmosphere. So it was that. It was, you'd hear the Houston Oilers #1 song sometimes coming back, and just they had great characters on those teams. Earl Campbell, Dan Pastorini, Billy White Shoes Johnson, Elvin Bethea, Robert Brazil, Curly Culp. Just great. Kenny Burrow was another. 00. They had those great characters, which is what made 70s football great. And then they also, they just kind of quite didn't make it. It was so heartbreaking. And I wanted to cover that team because they meant so much to their community. And like I said, they just didn't quite make it. Had they not been in the same division as the Steelers, things might have played out differently. They had to play the Steelers 3 times in 78 and 79. And in the regular season, they split. Pittsburgh and Houston split in 77, 78, 79. Those teams really respected each other a lot. And if you listen to my recent podcast with Jack Ham, he talks about how serious that rivalry was, and how difficult it was to play against the Oilers. So, had things worked out a little differently, let's say the Steelers don't come over to the AFC. Even something as simple as the Steelers not coming over to the AFC during the merger, and it's, the Lions or something. And the Oilers are in the same division as the Lions at that time. And the Steelers and Cowboys have to play each other in the NFC. Well, that's a whole different dynamic, and you might have the Oilers in a couple of Super Bowls then. I wanted to cover that. Yeah, and I wanted to see how the guys felt about it now.
And talking about that, those division rivalries, obviously you're building teams to face, your toughest competition to get to the playoffs. The Oilers were running 3-4 defenses through, at least the last second half of the 70s there. And I just wondered if if anyone on the team talked about how that maybe gave them some distinct advantage or not, or if it was kind of a wash versus 4-3 teams, things of that nature.
I'm glad you brought that up. There's a really interesting story behind that. When I talked to Coach Biles, who's, rest in peace, since passed away, but he was a great guy. And he was the defensive coordinator. And Bum Phillips was originally the defensive assistant when he got there under Sid Gilman. And Sid Gilman told them that he wanted to run a defense similar to Miami's defense in the mid-70s, because that defense was dominant. So Coach Biles and Coach Phillips, did their research. They said we need a great nose tackle. And what became of that was the Oilers traded, I think it was Sid Gilman that orchestrated the trade. They traded John Matuzak. That's who it was. They traded John Matuzak to Kansas City for Curly Culp and a first-round draft choice. Now, you got to remember, John Matuzak was a first overall pick one year for the Oilers. So while that deal sounds crazy, and it probably is, It really is when you think about it, because Curly Culp's in the Hall of Fame. But that was the big deal, and then they used that first round draft pick to pick Robert Brazil, who's a second Hall of Famer. So those were two of the pillars of that 3-4 defense, which was modeled after Miami's defense.
That's interesting. Speaking, of course, trades and kind of changing of the guard in the 1980 season, of course, the Oilers send Pastorini to Oakland, right? And they get three Raider legends and Stabler and Tatum and Casper, and the Raiders send Villapiano to the Bills, and who ends up winning the Super Bowl, but the Raiders piloted by Jim Plunkett. So, I mean, the fortunes kind of changed really strongly in that. It's interesting. I wonder if these teammates, you talk about the camaraderie and the brotherhood, I wonder if they talk much about the chemistry of the teams and how important that is for to really gel, particularly at the right time of the season.
Yeah, and I really tried to convey that both in the book Red, White, and Columbia Blue, and the documentary I did, We Were the Oilers, the Love Blue era, which all are available on Amazon. And I really dug deep into that. I do think leadership, especially from a quarterback position, is a very overlooked component of what makes championship teams. Dan Pastorini was the leader of those Oilers, and he played injured a lot. The players respected him a ton. Not that they didn't respect Ken Stabler. They loved having Ken Stabler come in. It's just a different dynamic if you think about having a different manager at work. For example, you might have two really good managers, but it's different, and there's an adjustment period. And Chad Hennings from the Cowboys of the 90s, who I interviewed for the podcast, he talked about that when Jimmy Johnson left the Cowboys and Barry Switzer came in. He said they were both good coaches. It was just their styles were so different. And in the Oilers' case, they had built a history with Dan Pastorini, and he was gone. And there's a long story behind the trade that goes all the way back to 1978, after the previous year's AFC Championship game. And Bump Phillips and Dan Pastorini both regretted the trade later. And if you look at what happened to the Oilers, 1980, ironically, they end up losing to the Raiders in the wild card game at Oakland. And then Bump Phillips is fired. And then, this is so crazy to think about, but it's true. The Houston Oilers never made the AFC Championship game again. Never, until they were the Tennessee Titans. That was the next time they won the AFC. They went to the AFC Championship game. So that's what Houston's fortunes were. And I think within a couple of years, they were 2-14 after Bump Phillips had gone. For Dan Pastorini, he's the Raiders starter in 1980. And then he breaks his leg in game 5. And he comes back. I'm not even sure they activated him when he was ready to come back. He talks about that in his book that I've got right up here, Taking Flack, his autobiography, which is really well done. But I don't think they activated him. And Dan Pastorini went from being one of the strongest arms in the NFL and one of the most well-known players in 78 and 79 to after 80, 81. If you started watching football in 1980, you wouldn't have any memory of Dan Pastorini. I mean, that's how fast, and that's a good example of how fast. A lot of players call the NFL not for long. That's a good example of how fast fortunes can change for the players.
I was just talking to another author, Joe Zagorski, who wrote a book exclusively about the NFL in the '70s, how important a decade it was, and talked about how 1980 was really this sea change. The Raiders finally came to the fore. The Cowboys were strong but struggling, and the new crop, the NFC coming along, et cetera, et cetera. I just wonder what era of the sport now kind of is the most important in your mind.
The 1950s under Bert Bell, where they started building television into the equation. The pinnacle of that was the '58 NFL championship game. And after that game, the Giants Colts great overtime NFL championship game, football was on its way to becoming pro football. NFL football was on its way to becoming not just the most popular sport in America, but one of the most popular sources of entertainment. I mean, it's as popular as Hollywood almost, or rock and roll. I mean, it is, the amount of revenue that the NFL generates is incredible, and the popularity of it. I mean, if you look at the Nielsen ratings for any given year, I mean, a lot of the top rated shows are NFL games. Like, a lot of times are regular season games. So I think that was the turning point. I think right now, if you want to talk about like a seminal moment and seminal era, I think that the '50s, then the merger in 1970, and Pete Rozelle getting the league on all three networks. You think about this at the time when there was no cable, and he had them on CBS in the NFC, at NBC for the AFC, and then Monday Night Football on ABC on Monday night. So he had them on all three networks, and the '70s, it just exploded. You look at the first Super Bowl, you can see a lot of empty seats in the first Super Bowl. By Super Bowl 13, I mean, it's already, an unofficial American holiday by that second Cowboys-Steelers Super Bowl. So I think those are the two seminal moments. Now, one thing that's cool about right now today is that we're seeing another changeover of eras. And this happens every now and again, because we had Manning retire a few years ago. We had Breeze retire, Roethlisberger retire. Rodgers is going to retire at some point. Brady's going to retire at some point. And now you start to see the new generation come in. You got Mahomes, who's already won a Super Bowl. You got Josh Allen. You got Joe Burrow. So now you've got this next generation coming up, this next generation of stars. And that's always exciting to watch, because this is a new generation.
For sure. Well, it's interesting. You mentioned, obviously you're a guitarist. I'm a guitarist as well. So, that entertainment
cool.
factor. Yeah. So, it's like, wow, they don't have guitar heroes anymore, but these new guys will come along. They're here, and they'll, I guess it remains to be seen how the front office will kind of equip them. And if you'll see I mean, I don't think you'll ever see a dynasty like a personal dynasty like Brady's, or a personal career. I mean, that's going to be, I don't know if we'll live to see that, but it's just something amazing, and something maybe for these kids to try to, young men, to try to model themselves on.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, Belichick was able to do it in free agency to keep a team winning championships. Brady was able to win without Belichick, which was pretty impressive. Yeah, the only quarterback in career that really is at that level is probably Otto Grahams, who went to 10 straight league championship games. And that is mind-blowing. A solid decade of going to the league championship. either in the AAFC or the NFL. So you never know. You never know what you'll see again. We've got a couple of records that have stood for 70 years, in Norm Van Brocklin's single game passing record and Dick Night Train Lane's single season interception record, and those have lasted 70 years, even with expanded schedules. But who knows what records the next generation will break or set, or what kind of teams will stay together, or what kind of coaches will come up, or what kind of new, when the T formation offense was started, it dominated the league, and if you think of college football, when the wishbone came out, it was unstoppable. So is somebody going to come up with a new scheme in the NFL? I don't know. We don't know. So, and it might take the league a while to catch up to it. So, we don't know. Maybe there will be another career like Brady's. Maybe there won't. But it's always fun to watch.
It is such an ever evolving game that it certainly continues to captivate us. And works like yours are what, obviously, and you're a tabletop gamer, so that when you're trying to use these teams and play on a tabletop, that works like this to really get into the era and the mentality and the kind of the play by play. This is really essential stuff to dig into. When did you already talked about playing Strat-O-Matic in the 80s, and you're a multi-sport guy too. I mean, what was kind of your motivation? Why did you start? What is the drive to play these sports, on cardboard and on tabletop?
Yeah, I think at first I was just intrigued with the ability to see what happened if certain teams played each other, or what it was like to manage a team. And then it was just so much fun. We played as friends. It helped strengthen our bond as friends, playing Strat-O-Matic, everything. I mean, within a couple of years, our neighborhood, I had personally baseball, basketball, and football, and other kids in the neighborhood had those, plus hockey, plus college football. So, I mean, we were often playing some sort of a Strat-O-Matic game. So there was that part of it too. And then, I was running my own leagues, I was keeping my own stats. I'd create leagues. Eventually I started getting some of the vintage sets. I know I had the 56 set. I think I got a couple from the mid 60s. I know I got the 1927 set at some point. And I would keep getting the pennant winners each year when they would come out, and I would create leagues, with those teams and play them out, and see how they would do against each other. It was always really a lot of, I think what kept me going was just that it was a lot of fun.
What were some of the most memorable moments or upsets among your what ifs? Like, what was a what if you had to do, and was it kind of an interesting outcome?
I don't remember all that much. I don't remember the, simulation games as well as I do the real games. But I do remember playing a 7-game series between the Yankees during when they won 3 championships against the 27 Yankees. And the specialized relief pitching for the later Yankees did really make a big difference. So that was one thing that was really interesting to me, that I remember. The other thing, I joined a Strat-O-Matic football league when I was in my 20s, and we all drafted players out of the current season. We had a big draft. So we all had customized teams, and there were 28 of us, I think. I mean, or 32. I mean, it was enough for all the teams, I think, are pretty close to it. And that was really a lot of fun because you got to, and if anybody has a chance to join a league out there where you can compete against people, and not only that, but just kind of share the game and have fun together and build friendships, and just kind of in this crazy world of ours get together for 3 hours and play out a simulated game, and the kind of insulated world that is. It's a great thing to do.
For sure. It's a great, and it really does fuel the imagination. Again, thanks to work like yours, you can really, it's kind of a gateway to the history. And so books like yours, and you have some upcoming projects as well, correct?
Yeah, I do. I've got this season, the 2022 season, from on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. I'll be on the radio each week with Upton Bell. That'll be on the SportsMap Radio Network across 70 to 80 stations in the U.S. So you can check your local listings, as Pat Summerall might say back in the day. So yeah, I've got that going on. I'm doing some oral history work with some HBCU players, and I just got a developmental grant for that, and so I'm working on that project. That's why I was chatting with Elvin Bethea yesterday. So I've got that going on, and then the podcast, keeps rolling. I keep trying to find players and getting their stories down. Recently, I connected with Bill Butler, who has a great story. He was a rookie on Lombardi's '59 Packers, and then ended up on the Cowboys the next year. So he was on the first Cowboys team ever, and then he wound up on the Vikings a few years later, and actually caused the fumble that Jim Marshall ran back the wrong way. So, you've got these guys who've got such incredible stories. And in Bill's case, he grew up in rural Wisconsin on a farm. He said this is a great, if you can picture a kid in 1959, he said he had 3 contracts in front of him. He had a Milwaukee Braves contract, a Green Bay Packers contract, and a Canadian Football League contract. And if you can think of a kid in the 50s just going, what should I take here? It's just great. And all these guys have these stories. They've got their own personal stories, and so that's going to keep coming out on the Game Before the Money. I just had Sean Alexander. I got a brief interview with him at an autograph show, the Seahawks running back. Turns out he's been good friends with Charles Woodson and Randy Moss since high school. So nobody would know this stuff unless we actually kind of dig into their own personal histories, which I hope people do more of. Or I'm glad that I'm able to do it, and I hope people care enough to listen, because in the end they are regular guys with a story, and a lot of times there was, like in Bart Starr's case, the Alabama basketball coach recommending him to the Packers. There's some sort of break or opportunity or something that just fell in the right place for a lot of these guys, even when they're superstars, and it seems like, oh yeah, well, of course that would happen. Everybody's got their own story, and it's always interesting to hear.
It really is instructive. Maybe that's part of the appeal as well. Just, how did you navigate life? Terry Bradshaw, navigating the difficulties of, a young career and maturing as a pro. It's a lot of life lessons in, the spectacle, amid all the spectacle.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because, as we get older, we have fewer and fewer elders to whom we can turn. And, that's another great thing is almost inevitably somebody will say something that's kind of like, wow, that's a great life lesson in there too, be it something their coach taught them or just something on their road to the pros, or something that happened to them outside of life. I remember Rocky Blyer saying in the book, talking about how he had gotten hit with a bullet, and then he said he was still setting up like his, you know, his weapon to stay in battle. And I was like, Rocky, you mean you got shot and you just kept going? He was like, well, yeah, it was my responsibility to do that. And I was like, wow, if I've got a responsibility to say, you know, do the laundry or something, you know, I've got no excuses after hearing something like that. You know, my little day-to-day responsibilities, you know, if I shrug them off, you know, it just kind of puts things into perspective a lot of times, hearing these guys' stories, you know. And Rocky Blyer, of course, is an extreme one because he was wounded in Vietnam, but you know, yeah, it's incredible. And you know, speaking of Vietnam, you know, the other thing that, you know, that has been covered a couple of times in the Game Before the Money podcast is, you know, Vietnam was out there, and if you had an athletic scholarship, you were in college and you had that deferment. And for a lot of guys who might not have been in college otherwise, the Vietnam War might have been their path. In Rocky's case, they just didn't have any room in the reserves left. Even though he was on the Steelers, he still went to Vietnam. And you know, when you talk about differences in the game, that's another one. Military service. Paul Hornung, you know, and I covered this on the blog on the GameBeforeTheMoney.com, where Boyd Dowler was telling me how he and Paul Hornung and Ray Nitschke all got called into active military duty during the 1961 season. Paul Hornung actually missed a game or two. And Paul Hornung's an NFL superstar at the time. Lombardi was friends with President Kennedy, and President Kennedy got the three of them a deferment to play in the championship game against the Giants. But if you see the video, sometimes the video is on YouTube of the introductions, and you'll hear on the introduction, you know, on deferment from the U.S. Army, or on furlough from the U.S. Army, Boyd Dowler, receiver, Packers, you know, when they're introducing the teams. So that is another thing that has really changed, and in some instances really changed the course of history. In Cotton Davidson's case, he was the first round draft pick of the Colts in 1954 and was going to be the only quarterback coming into camp in 1955. He was drafted into the Army. And so he had to go to the Army. And he had to leave the Colts. The Colts were really without anybody. And so they ended up signing a kid named Johnny Unitas. And by the time Cotton got back, Cotton originally wore number 19 also, which I think about that. Yeah, Unitas came back, had his job and his number. But they were good friends. They were roommates, and Cotton used to kid him like, hey, man, you even got my number. And Johnny was like, well, you can have the number back, you know. But
Yeah.
but yeah, you know, that's something that would never happen today. You know, Joe Burrow would not lose his starting quarterback position through military service. It just wouldn't happen. There are a lot of players who miss seasons. Bob Skoronski is another one off the top of my head who missed a year of because of military service. Yale Larry, Hall of Famer. He was in Korea for a year, and the Lions missed him. They lost the championship game that year. If you can imagine one of the best defensive backs in the NFL getting called into military service and missing the season, that's another way that things have changed quite a bit.
Did you ever bring any Strat-O cards and show them to some of the folks you interview? Have them sign them or just take a look at them?
No, I've never even thought about that really till now. No, and I don't really ask people for autographs. It's just not something that I want to do. I mean, they're being really generous with their time. Never really talked to anybody about Strat-O-Matic either.
One of our APBA Hall of Famers, Pete Simonelli, had gotten some autographs from Joe Torre, was one of the first pro athlete and APBA players, and a lot of APBA cards you'll see out there. Folks will get them signed. I imagine Strat-O, it's actually a bigger card, some of the vintage ones, so you can get a nice bigger platform. But in any case, Michael, thank you so much. Such a ton of great stories and many more in the book and your upcoming radio show and on the podcast. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I can't wait to dig into these books.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me on, and it's really fun to talk about all this stuff, and especially connect with fellow Strat and APBA players. It's one of those things where you if you do it, you get it, and if you don't play it, then you probably don't get it. But it's really great to chat with people who really know the enjoyment of playing these games.
Awesome. Yeah, and folks, buy the books, listen to the show, get some more insights while you're working on these, particularly any replay projects that maybe are out of your personal era. This is a great gateway to kind of learn more about motivations about the team and just kind of really enjoy your projects a little more, I think.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it.
You got it, sir. Thank you.